If you were standing in a room full of people, and you were the only one willing to speak up for what's right, what would you do? The day's story isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about one person who chose to speak the truth with calm resolve in a world fueled by anger. A still afternoon spread across a small town in Ohio. The golden sunlight fell softly over faded red brick rooftops, like honey slowly poured by an invisible hand. The sky was clear and blue, so calm it seemed as if time itself had stopped to rest. In the heart of town, the local grocery store was just as it always was. No flashy signage, no looping background music designed to sell. Here, greetings didn't need words. Just a glance and a nod were enough. Everything moved slowly, as if the rhythm of the town itself pulsed through each familiar footstep. The sound of cartwheels rolled gently over old tile. The scanner at checkout beeped steadily like the ticking of an old clock still loyal to time. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery, blending with the sweet scents of oranges, apples, and strawberries. If there was any place that made you forget the chaos outside, even for a moment, it was here. But can anything stay peaceful forever? Have you ever felt a moment when everything around you seems a little too perfect, and something inside you whispers that something is about to happen? Near the produce section, an elderly woman carefully inspected apples one by one. She was in her 70s, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun held by a plastic amber clip. Her beige knit sweater and worn loafers hinted at someone practical, frugal, and perhaps a little stubborn. Her face showed little emotion, but her eyes, behind thick glasses, scanned each apple as if grading them by a standard only she understood. You've probably met someone like her before, the kind of person the whole neighborhood talks about, with a half smile, half sigh. That's just how she is. At the same moment, in the aisle next to hers, a young man entered the scene like an unfamiliar note in a familiar song. Darrell, early 20s, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a deep blue hoodie and jeans with frayed hems. His left arm held a shopping basket. His right hand held a phone, its screen casting a soft light across his cheek. He moved quietly, without rush, without noise, as if time was something he allowed to pass rather than chase. He only intended to grab a few things, like any other shopper, but his presence stirred something in the air. The distance between him and the elderly woman was only a few steps. He reached out to take a bag of oranges. In that very moment, she looked up. Her gaze stopped cold. It wasn't about the oranges. It wasn't because she recognized someone. It was because of the person standing in front of her. It was just a glance, but it froze the entire space. In those eyes, there was no curiosity, no goodwill. There was something else, something without a name, but everyone has felt it before. Cold, judgmental, and dismissive. Have you ever felt rejected simply for existing? And then something no one expected happened. She spoke. A sentence. Soft as a breeze, but sharp as a blade, slicing through the thin layer of peace. It happened the moment the old woman turned and met his gaze. In that instant, her face looked as if a chill wind had swept across it. Her eyes narrowed, sharp as metal, her lips pressed into a tight line as if a boundary had just been drawn. And then, without a breath, without hesitation, she said it. People like you don't belong here. The words came out clearly, loud enough that 2 or 3 people nearby froze. Someone's hand stopped mid-reach. Someone blinked rapidly, like they couldn't believe what they just heard. Darrell flinched. His hand still hovered over his phone, the blue light still blinking softly on the edge of the case. He looked up, his eyes full of confusion. Not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well. But the old woman wasn't finished. Each word that followed pierced deeper into the fragile calm around them. Why don't you go back to Africa, where you people belong? The air seemed to thicken. It was as if every oxygen molecule had been sucked out of the aisle. The scanner fell silent. Cartwheels stopped rolling. The whole store sank into a suffocating stillness. A young mother nearby pulled her child closer, quickly but quietly, as if her instincts had taken over before reason had a chance to react. An older man holding a bag of potatoes stood frozen, gripping it tighter, as if bracing for something that might spiral out of control. Have you ever witnessed a moment where everything felt frozen, not from fear, but because no one knew how to face such a brutal truth? Darrell stood there. He didn't step back. He didn't move forward. He didn't speak. His face looked strangely calm, but anyone truly watching would see it. Deep in his eyes, a battle was raging, between reason and emotion, between anger and dignity. Should he respond? Should he stay silent? Should he be the one to say what the entire room was thinking, but no one had the courage to voice? No one around him stepped in, not a single don't, not one "I'm sorry" from anyone who witnessed it. Not one person walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "I'm with you." The old woman still stood there, clutching her bag of apples as if it were her own definition of righteousness. Her gaze was as unyielding as a wall built from generations of inherited prejudice. In her proud stance, there wasn't a trace of remorse, only a chilling certainty that she had done the right thing. A young employee stacking bananas nearby quietly froze. He looked around, his eyes silently asking, "Is anyone going to do something?" But that question was swallowed by silence. From a checkout lane farther away, a cashier leaned out to see what was happening. And then, as if feeling guilty just for watching, she turned away. They were no longer just shoppers. They had become witnesses. But being a witness without taking action, is that really any different from being complicit? Reluctant, but unable to walk away, Darrell finally lifted his head. His eyes remained calm, like the surface of a still lake. But beneath that surface surged an ocean of emotion. Waves of feeling rolled in, layer after layer, crashing against the rocky shore of restraint. In that brief moment, hundreds of thoughts raced through his mind. He could have struck back. He could have raised his voice, could have stormed off in outrage, and no one would blame him if he did. But he knew too well. Those reactions were exactly the trap laid out before him. A trap without ropes or hooks, yet powerful enough to make someone walk right into it on their own. Instead, Darrell drew a breath, long, deep, then exhaled. He shifted his shopping basket to his left hand, stood tall, and fixed his gaze ahead, as if searching for a center of gravity within himself. The supermarket stayed deathly still, as if the entire space were holding its breath with him. "Ma'am?" His voice rose, not loud, but clear and resonant. "Do you truly understand what you just said?" There was no anger, no aggression, just a question, simple yet weighty, a pause, a chance. In that very moment, Darrell gave the old woman an opportunity to step back, to realize, to take back the venom in her words if she wanted, but she didn't. And she didn't need to. "I said what I think," she snapped, her eyes flashing with a self-granted sense of authority. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." A faint sound stirred near the bread aisle. A woman let out a quiet gasp. Over by the dairy section, an elderly man pulled out his phone, but slipped it back into his pocket, as if what he had just witnessed was far too familiar to be worth recording. A little boy clung tightly to his mother's hand. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could clearly feel the tension thickening with every breath. And in that moment, every eye turned toward Darrell. They waited for him to speak. They wanted to see how he would respond, not out of concern, but because their silence needed to be absolved by his voice. They hadn't said anything, so now they hoped he would say it for them. Darrell understood. This was no longer just about him and an elderly woman. This was a deeper fracture. And every move he made, every word he spoke, would stand in for those who had never been heard, never been defended, never been acknowledged as part of us. He drew a breath once more. His eyes scanned the shelves around him, then returned to the old woman. "I was born here," he began, his voice steady as if reading a truth carved in stone. "I grew up here. I studied, I work, I pay taxes, and I live by the very values this country claims to uphold." He paused, not to catch his breath, but to let each word reach ears that had long chosen not to hear. "You don't have to like me, but you don't have the right to say I don't belong here just because my skin doesn't look like yours." There was a shift. A young mother bent down to adjust her child's hat, but kept her ears tuned in. A supermarket employee quietly stepped back, then froze. "Because if my right to exist can be dismissed with a single sentence," Darrell continued, his gaze sweeping across the faces in front of him, "then none of us are truly safe." That truth, spoken with calm conviction, carried more weight than any outburst ever could. It didn't break the silence with anger. It broke it with honesty, and honesty can't be ignored forever. Beneath the dim yellow lights of the grocery store, where every shadow lay still across the silent shelves, Darrell's voice remained level and low. He didn't need to raise it. He didn't need to shout. The stillness in his tone made each word sharper than any accusation. "My great-grandfather was a sharecropper." The first sentence rang out, slow and steady, like a bell awakening something that had been forgotten for far too long. Darrell's eyes stayed locked on the old woman before him, unwavering. Tilled land for others. He didn't own any. His name wasn't on a single deed. A brief pause. A silence thick with the weight of something on the brink of breaking open. But he had a dream. His voice wasn't loud, but it echoed like a drumbeat inside the hearts of those standing around him. A dream that one day his children and grandchildren wouldn't be looked down on, wouldn't be turned away, wouldn't have to lower their heads just to walk into a public space. An older man near the freezer removed his glasses and dabbed at his reddened eyes with the corner of his shirt. No one noticed him directly, but that quiet gesture was a silent testimony that Darrell's words weren't just personal. They were historical. They were real. "My grandfather's father was a slave." Darrell paused, not for breath, but to allow the past to step fully into the present. Her sweepas forced to march at gunpoint, shipped across the ocean, shackled at the wrists and ankles, made to labor on land owned by men who never saw him as human. A young boy nearby clutched his mother's hand, eyes wide with confusion, his whisper barely audible in the heavy silence. "Mom, what's happening?" His mother held his hand tighter. She didn't answer, not because she didn't have words, but because she too was learning something she may never have dared to confront before. "The lashes on my grandfather's back," Darrow continued, his gaze piercing through time, "weren't just meant to break his body. They were meant to crush his dignity. But they never did." His voice burned low, like a quiet flame in a cold room, not raging, not screaming, but hot enough that anyone standing near could feel the heat or the sting. "It was those same calloused hands," Darrell said, that nailed the boards, raised the walls, and laid the foundation we all stand on today, right here in this country. The old woman's eyes shifted slightly. A small motion, but enough for every gaze in the room to begin shifting too, from caution to scrutiny. She no longer stood in the comfort of silent agreement. Around her was a circle of silence, but it was no longer complicit. It was re-evaluating. Darrell stepped forward, just one step, slow, unthreatening. It was simply a movement grounded in certainty. "So," he said, his voice no longer tinged with sadness but sharp, like steel forged in fire. "When you told me I don't belong here, you didn't just insult me." He lifted his chin, his gaze unwavering. "You denied history, denied sacrifice, denied the blood and sweat of millions who were buried beneath the bricks of an America they were never allowed to fully claim." No one spoke, no one moved. And for the first time that afternoon, something rang louder than shouting, something stronger than hate. It was the truth, and truth cannot be brushed off as a mere inconvenience. The old woman pressed her lips together. She said nothing, but the way her hands gripped the apple bag said everything. Her bony fingers clenched the handles so tightly her knuckles turned white. The amber hair clip in her silver hair trembled slightly, as if her whole body were struggling to balance on the fragile edge between pride and truth. The air was no longer simply tense. It had transformed into a solemn stillness, like the hush that falls in a church when someone for the first time confesses something real after a lifetime of denial. She didn't respond. Her lips quivered. Her eyes blinked rapidly, searching for a way out, but every path was blocked by the gaze of awareness. There was no judgment, but there was illumination. And illumination cannot be avoided. Darrell stood firm, not stepping back, not moving forward, but his voice lifted slightly, not to overpower, but to let the truth be heard more clearly, to let it carry further through even the thickest layers of silence. "What about my grandfather?" The question dropped like a small stone, but its ripples reached the farthest corners of the space. He was a soldier in World War II. He fought for this country, carried the ideals of freedom and justice onto the battlefields of Europe. But when he came home, he wasn't allowed to sit at the same table as white men, wasn't allowed to drink from the regular water fountains, wasn't allowed to live like someone who had risked his life for his nation. He paused, not because he'd lost his place, but to let everyone fully absorb the weight of what had just been spoken. No one moved. Even the steady hum of the air conditioner seemed to drift away. A young woman holding a loaf of bread had frozen mid-step in the aisle, her gaze still and silent. "My grandfather didn't leave, he stayed." Darrell continued, his voice low but solid as stone. There was no bitterness, only memory, and memory cannot be denied. He stayed because he believed in America's promise, even when America refused to believe in him. A few heads began to bow, not because they had been called out, but because in the quiet they were calling themselves in. Darrell drew a breath, his eyes still fixed on the woman before him, like a steady light that doesn't flicker in the middle of a storm. "On my turrets," he went on, his voice softer this time, not from weakness, but because he was touching something more intimate than any medal or law could ever convey. They fought too, not with weapons, not in courtrooms, but with their lives, every single day. A soft sniffle echoed from behind a shelf. Someone wiped tears away with their sleeve, not from sorrow, but from realizing, maybe for the first time, that something they'd always thought of as distant had actually lived beside them all along. My mother was a teacher, Darrell said. She taught her whole life, never caring where a child came from or what they looked like. She taught with her whole heart. When my father was a mechanic, he would pull over in the middle of the road to help anyone. Darrell took another breath, lighter this time, but deeper. Even you, if your car broke down. That sentence carried no anger. It wasn't an attack, it was a mirror wide enough to reflect every person in that grocery store, every person watching, every person who had ever thought they stood outside of the story. And now you say I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa? Darrell gently shook his head, not to reject her as a person, but to reject the prejudice she had become the voice of. Ma'am, I am a part of this country, no less than you, maybe even more. His voice now carried a weight that only those whose families had endured generations of rejection could possess. Because my family paid a price far too high, not just with labor, but with blood, with sweat, with tears, for the very flag flying out there. He lifted his head, eyes drifting toward the large window and the vast sky beyond it. There the American flag swayed gently in the evening breeze, moved by the wind, or perhaps by something deeper, shifting beneath the surface. The old woman clutched her bag of apples so tightly the knuckles of her aged hands turned stark white. Her face flushed, whether from anger, shame, or a feeling she'd never learned to name. Her lips quivered as if she wanted to speak, something to defend herself, to resist the rising tide around her. But when she opened her mouth, not a single sound escaped. Her words caught, splintered, and dissolved into silence. Darrow stepped back, not as a retreat, but as if making room for truth to expand. He remained upright, his gaze now moving beyond the woman, reaching across the entire room. Eyes stared back at him, quiet, focused, as though, for the first time, they weren't just hearing, they were truly listening. I could have stayed silent and walked away. His voice didn't rise to dominate the space. It moved through it. But silence doesn't heal ignorance. He paused, giving the words time to settle into the minds around him. If we don't speak up, he continued, we let hatred grow. We allow its poison to be passed down, from adults to children, from one generation to the next. He turned to face the old woman once more. But now, his eyes no longer held sadness or anger. What they held was compassion, genuine and calm in a way that felt disarming. I'm not standing here to shame you. A brief pause, then he continued. I'm standing here to remind all of us that words carry weight, and actions even more so. The grocery store fell silent, like a theater audience waiting for the final act's turning point. Even the faint click of a shopping cart wheel rolling in the distance sounded like a whisper in the profound stillness. And a middle-aged man in a checkered shirt and a faded baseball cap stepped forward toward Darrell, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to cut through the silence that had blanketed the room. He's right. His voice wasn't loud, but it echoed like a bell striking something deep inside someone. We have to do better than this. An elderly woman near the freezer nodded gently, then spoke. Her voice trembled, but it held steady like roots gripping deep soil. My daddy served in the war too. He always said, the only color that really matters is the red on that flag. The color of blood, the blood we all share. A young cashier lifted her head. Her words came out like a thought spoken aloud for the very first time. I've never seen someone handle something like that so beautifully. No one laughed, no one whispered. There was only a silence filled with agreement, like an apology that didn't need to be spoken, like the silent bow of a head at a funeral, not for a person, but for the long-buried truths we're only now beginning to mourn. The old woman stood frozen. She hadn't been yelled at, she hadn't been kicked out, but the eyes around the room, eyes that had just witnessed truth, had become the quietest, most unshakable judgment. She opened her mouth, once more trying to find the words. I didn't mean to. Her voice faded, growing thinner in the air, and then disappeared completely. Darrell looked at her, not with the piercing edge reserved for confronting prejudice, but with a deeper kind of sorrow, not for himself, but for a generation that never had the chance to learn how to begin again. It doesn't matter if you meant to or not. His voice was just a whisper now, soft as a breeze, but strong enough to slip past every wall people had built around themselves. What matters is how it made others feel. The moment passed, and then, from the deli counter came the sound of applause. A large man in a flower-streaked apron began to clap, hesitantly at first, as if unsure whether it was allowed. Then one more person joined in, and then the whole aisle slowly filled with scattered applause, tentative, uneven, but gradually finding a steady rhythm. No one clapped because Darrell had won. No one thought this had been a battle with a simple right or wrong. They clapped for something else. They clapped for courage, for a man who chose to stand tall in a place where it would have been so easy to bow his head. The old woman lowered hers. No more words to defend herself. No more eyes she could hide from. She pushed her cart toward the exit in silence, the wheels rolling across the old tiled floor like they were carrying away decades of unspoken weight. Darrell didn't follow her. He didn't need to. He had done what he came to do. A young woman approached him, her face full of emotion and gratitude. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, as if afraid to disturb the sacred stillness that still lingered in the air. "Thank you," she said, eyes filled with admiration, "for saying what so many of us have never dared to say." Darrell simply nodded, no need for more words. And then, like a breeze that had passed through, the room slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. But no one was the same anymore. Darrell allowed himself a faint smile, not one of triumph, though bet of knowing he had just planted a seed. He lifted his basket and walked on, slowly. "Sometimes," he whispered to himself, "it's not about winning or losing, as long as people are willing to hear the truth." The crowd dispersed. No one said much, but their eyes were different now. Some looked up at the ceiling, as if remembering the times they chose silence. Some pulled their children closer, holding them tighter. A message not in words, but in action. The moment didn't last long, but the echo would stay for a very long time. The grocery store no longer buzzed with its usual urgency. There was no small talk or laughter, just a slower rhythm, deeper, thoughtful. Darrell continued shopping, not in a rush, not avoiding anyone, and not looking for validation. He walked with quiet certainty, no trembling, no rage, but also no pretending that nothing had happened. At the checkout, the young cashier from earlier scanned his items. Her hands trembled slightly. She hadn't yet looked up. "What you said, it really meant something," the cashier spoke softly. "Not everyone could stand up like that, and still stay so calm?" Darryl smiled, his expression gentle now. "Sometimes staying calm is the only way people will actually listen." He took his grocery bag and turned to go, but not before leaving behind a sentence that made everyone pause, if only in their hearts. "Anger only builds more walls. Listening is how we start building bridges." Outside, the sun was slowly setting. Long shadows stretched across the parking lot like traces of old memories left behind on the pavement. The last rays of light cast a golden hue on the windshields of quiet cars parked in neat rows. Darryl stepped out of the grocery store, the breeze brushing softly against his shirt, and then he saw her. The old woman was sitting in her car, hands still gripping the steering wheel, eyes staring blankly ahead, as if trying to see through the windshield and through the broken pieces of memory in her mind. Darryl stopped, hesitant. He could have walked over, could have said something, could have closed the loop, but he didn't. Some lessons need time to settle, and he had already said enough. That night, at a small dinner table, the warm yellow light illumined at the streaks of grease still on his father's hands. A quiet man who spent his life buried in engines, but never let the world stain his heart. Darryl told the story. No embellishment, no fury, just the truth. His father listened in silence, no interruptions, no lectures. Finally, he placed his hand on the table and looked straight at his son. "You did the right thing." His voice was low and steady. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching." He raised his head, eyes serious but not heavy. "People like her, they don't change overnight. But today you planted a seed." A slight nod, like a quiet blessing. "The rest is to let it grow." Darryl understood. No more words were needed. Across town, in a small house, dinner remained untouched. The old woman sat silently, staring at her plate, but her mind wasn't there. It was replaying the face of the young man. His eyes held no hatred, no sarcasm, only the clear gaze of truth. Outside, the wind gently stirred the curtain, and in that quiet room, for the first time in many years, silence didn't feel like indifference. It felt like reflection. Darryl's words weren't just sound. They were like soft knocks against the deep cracks in beliefs she had long mistaken for truth. For the first time, she found herself doubting. Not others, but the very things she had always believed were right. She thought of her grandchildren, of the world they were growing up in, of what legacy she would leave in their understanding of that world. And then something unfamiliar rose within her, the desire to change. In the days that followed, the story from the supermarket spread through the neighborhood, not because people craved drama, but because of how Darryl had faced it. No outbursts, no shouting, just calm, just truth. He didn't go on TV, he didn't post about it, he didn't chase the spotlight, but like a pebble dropped in still water, his words rippled outward, touching hearts along the way. Strangers began to approach him, not to praise him, but to thank him. They shared old stories about wounds, about prejudice, and about the times they'd chosen to stay silent. One quiet act of courage can open up conversations society has avoided for far too long. And the old woman? She began to change. Not quickly, not completely, but enough to start asking the questions. Why do I think this way? Who taught me that? And do I still want to believe it? She didn't know if she'd ever see Darryl again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to say she was sorry. In that moment reminds us that compassion, conviction, and truth have the power to transform an entire community. To take a stand doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes it just takes one person speaking truth with calm and letting the truth speak for itself. And you, the one reading this story, your words and actions carry weight. They can wound or they can heal. They can divide or they can unite. If this story moved you, share it. Be someone who inspires. Because one by one, we can change the world. A world not driven by fear or hate, but filled with understanding, compassion, and kindness.